In 383, the former Qin dynasty, which was established by the Di people and ruled over all of northern China, invaded the eastern Jin dynasty that ruled over southern China, but was decisively defeated at the Battle of the Fei River. After the battle, the eastern Jin dynasty launched a series of northward expeditions that brought its rule all the way to the Qin Mountains and the Yellow River, but ultimately failed to recover the remainder of the north from the barbarians. The former Qin dynasty collapsed after the Battle of the Fei River, replaced by a number of unstable successor states that jockeyed one another for control of the north. First, let us focus our attention to the east, which had previously been ruled by the Murong branch of the Xianbei people as the former Yan dynasty until its conquest by the former Qin dynasty in 370. Murongs, the uncle of the last emperor of the former Yan dynasty, rebelled against the former Qin dynasty after the Battle of the Fei River, eventually re-establishing the Yan dynasty, with this iteration known in history as the Later Yan dynasty. He established his capital at Zhongshan, near the northern edge of the North China Plain. Meanwhile, a rival branch of the Murong family established another Yan state, known in history as the Western Yan dynasty. And to the north of both Later Yan and Western Yan was a state of Northern Wei, ruled by a different branch of the Xianbei, the Tuoba Xianbei. Later Yan, which occupied the rich, densely populated region of Hebei, the portion of the North China Plain north of the Yellow River, was the most prominent of these three Xianbei states. It was fairly Sinicized compared to many of the other barbarian states in northern China during this time period, without relying on separate government structures to administer its barbarian and Han Chinese populations. Its emperor Murongs was also one of the leading generals and statesmen of his day, even if he was already an old man in his 60s by the time he became emperor. On the other hand, Northern Wei, under its first king Tuoba Gui, was dwarfed by Later Yan. Unlike the Murong Xianbei, the Tuoba Xianbei that ruled Northern Wei were based out of the much poorer, more remote border regions and were still largely nomadic at the time of Northern Wei's founding. The Tuoba Xianbei had previously ruled over a state in the region known as Dai, with its capital at Shengle on the southern edge of the steppes to the south of the Yin Mountains. Dai had been conquered by the former Qin dynasty in 376. As the collapse of the former Qin dynasty was ongoing, the 15-year-old grandson of the previous Dai king, Tuoba Gui, was declared the new king of Dai in 386, and later that year the name of the state was changed from Dai to Wei. The first few years of Tuoba Gui's reign is extremely confusing to piece together, because after Northern Wei eventually grew to conquer all of northern China, many events from its early rise were rewritten to cover up embarrassing details. Of course, records of events from all throughout Chinese history could have been altered to fit certain narratives, but in this case there was a methodical, well-documented effort to obfuscate the details of scandalous events, and so unfortunately for us, much of what did actually happen may now be forever lost to history. But what we do know is that, at the beginning of his reign, Tuoba Gui faced many tough enemies from rival tribes and needed the strong military backing of both the Helan, his mother's tribe, and Murongs, who was his great-uncle due to a political marriage between the Tuoba and the Murong. On multiple occasions, later Yan sent an army northward to intervene in Northern Wei affairs. In part, with the backing of later Yan, Tuoba Gui was able to defeat his enemies piecemeal, including the Helan who had been his ally, to secure his position as the undisputed ruler of Northern Wei. Tuoba Gui also led many expeditions against other nomadic groups in the region, capturing their herds and forcing their members to become subjects of Northern Wei. To the northeast were the Kumo Xi and their close relatives, the Qidan, more popularly known in the west as the Khitans. Many centuries later, the Khitans will grow to dominate far northern China to such an extent that one of the traditional European names for China, Cathay, comes from the name Khitan. Although at the time of our narrative, the Khitan people was just being mentioned in history for the first time in the context of being one of Tuoba Gui's many punching bags. There was also the Tiele, alternatively known as the Chile, one of the earliest Turkic peoples in recorded history. The Tiele was a particularly numerous people spread out over a vast area and were referred to in ancient Chinese records by different names depending on the context. For this time period in our narrative, the ones that migrated southward into Han Chinese territories were typically referred to as the Dingling. One group of the Dingling settled in the Central Plains, initially allying with Murongs when he first rebelled against former Qin, but eventually going its own ways to establish a small state in the region named Wei, and known in history as Zhai Wei, after the surname of its ruling family. Further to the north, the Tiele that remained on the steppes were known as the Gaoche, or literally the tall wagons, which likely referred to their transportation tools. The Gaoche were nomadic and had a reputation for being especially fierce warriors, even if their lack of military organization meant that they often suffered defeats against their neighbors. Another rival of Northern Wei was the Rouran, a confederacy that likely consisted of Xianbei tribes which had stayed behind on the steppes rather than migrate further south. Some of their descendants, in turn, may have eventually migrated to Eastern Europe to become the Pannonian Avars that were to fight a long series of wars against the Byzantine Empire in the 500s and were eventually conquered by the Franks and Bulgars in the early 800s. And finally, to the west of Northern Wei was a branch of the Xiongnu named Tiefu. The name referred to those with Xiongnu fathers and Xianbei mothers. The chieftain of the Tiefu at the time was Liu Weichen, with Liu being the surname of the Xiongnu former Zhao dynasty imperial family that had ruled the region in the early 300s. Liu Weichen was descended from this imperial family. In 391, Liu Weichen was defeated by Tuoba Gui and killed, and afterwards some 5,000 people from his tribe were massacred. One of the few survivors was his 10-year-old son, Liu Bobo, who fled to a nearby Xianbei tribe, where he was given asylum by the chieftain and eventually married the chieftain's daughter. Now moving to northwestern China, many non-Han Chinese peoples had also settled in the region over the few preceding centuries. By far the most prominent were the Di and the Qiang, two closely related Proto-Tibetan groups who settled in large numbers across northwestern China, including the Fei River Valley. The mountainous region west of the Fei River Valley, stretching westward from the Liupan Mountains, known in ancient times as the Long Mountains, well into the Tibetan Plateau, was settled by various groups of Xianbei. This included the Tufa Xianbei, whose ancestors split off from the Tuoba Xianbei. Tufa was an alternative transliteration of Tuoba, the Qifu Xianbei, whose ancestry is unclear, and the Tuyu Hun, whose ancestors split off from the Murongs Xianbei. To the north of the Fei River Valley, the landscape was covered with vast expanses of hills and plateaus that stretch all the way to the plains around the bend of the Yellow River. In recent centuries, overgrazing has contributed to significant desertification here in the Ordos Desert. But 1600 years ago, what is now the Ordos Desert was still mostly grasslands punctuated by the occasional deserts or marshes. Various peoples, among them the Xiongnu, Xianbei, and Gaoche, grazed their herds in the region. Further to the west of all of this is the Hexi Corridor, or in English, the West River Corridor, due to its location to the west of the bend of the Yellow River. It is a thin, flat strip of land 900 kilometers long between the Qilian Mountains to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north, and serves as the bottleneck connecting China to the rest of Asia. A river named the Ruoshui, or literally the Weak River, originates as meltwater from the Qilian Mountains and flows through much of the Hexi Corridor until it evaporates into the Gobi Desert in a large inland delta. Although 1600 years ago the water flow of the Weak River was far more abundant than it is now, and its region was well suited for both settled agriculture and grazing. The Hexi Corridor was first conquered by the Han Dynasty around 100 BC, after which Liang province was established in the region. Large numbers of Han Chinese farmers settled here, eventually separating the nomadic regions to the north and south from one another, although nomadic groups continued to migrate through the Hexi Corridor, often settling among the established Han Chinese populations there. The Han Dynasty divided the Hexi Corridor into 4 commanderies, collectively known as the 4 commanderies of Hexi, which, from east to west, were Wu Wei, Zhangye, Jiuquan, and Dunhuang, all of which became famous stopping points along the Silk Road. And luckily for us, all 4 seats of these commanderies use the same names today as they did during the Han Dynasty. The one caveat is that for this time period, Wu Wei was known as Guzang, The remoteness of the Hexi corridor also meant that large numbers of Han Chinese refugees from other parts of northern China fled here during the barbarian invasions. In the early 300s, the Han Chinese inspector of Liang province established a state here named Liang, known in history as former Liang, because as we shall soon find out, it will not be the only Liang state to be established in this region during this time period. Former Liang was relatively peaceful compared to the rest of northern China during this time, and was able to preserve large amounts of writing and scholarship that were being lost elsewhere in northern China. It remained independent until it was conquered by the former Qin dynasty in 376. In 382, the emperor of former Qin, Fujian, sent the D general Lu Guang on an expedition through the Hexi corridor with an army 75,000 strong to bring the city-states of the Turin Basin, which had previously been protectorates of the Han dynasty, under former Qin control. Nowadays, the region is extremely dry. The Taklamakan Desert is one of the largest sandy deserts in the world, and the region around Lop Nor, a salt lake that has mostly dried up, is so desolate that China used to conduct its nuclear weapons tests there. But like the Ordos region, this region was also wetter 1600 years ago than it is today, when the Turin River, flowing from the Karakoram Mountains through the Taklamakan Desert to Lop Nor, passed through much larger oases than it does now. A number of city-states were established along the Turin River and its tributaries, although as these rivers shifted courses or dried up over the centuries, many of them became abandoned to the encroaching desert. In the 300s AD, the population in the region predominantly spoke the Tocharian languages, an extinct branch of the Indo-European languages, and the region was predominantly Buddhist due to its proximity to the Indian subcontinent. Upon arriving in the region, Lu Guang easily occupied the city-states in the Turin Basin, greatly enriching himself in the process. After the Battle of the Fei River in 383, rebellions broke out across the northwest against Fujian. The Qifu Xianbei declared their independence and eventually established a state also named Qin, known in history as Western Qin. Yao Chang, one of Fujian's key generals who came from the Qiang people, also rebelled, declaring a state that was again named Qin, with this one known in history as Later Qin. The Xianbei that had been resettled near Chang'an also rebelled to become Western Yan, laying siege to Chang'an. Fujian fled the siege, was captured by Yao Chang, and eventually murdered. The Western Yan forces sacked Chang'an in 385 but then abandoned it to migrate towards their ancestral lands further east. Yao Chang occupied the abandoned city and then declared himself emperor in 386. Remnants of the former Qin dynasty held on to a rump state, constantly waging war against later Qin. As rebellions were breaking out against his rule, Fujian was forced to recall Lu Guang and his army from the western regions. Lu Guang and his army marched home with 20,000 camels carrying loot and over 10,000 prized Central Asian horses. But with chaos unfolding further to the east, Lu Guang decided to occupy Liang province as he was passing through, eventually establishing himself at Guzang, modern-day Wu Wei, and declaring himself the heavenly king of Liang. He eventually occupied the entire Hexi corridor after years of brutal fighting. Fighting also continued between later Qin, under Yao Chang, and former Qin. In 393, Yao Chang was succeeded by his son Yao Xing, who in the following year decisively defeated and conquered former Qin. As the northwest was falling into chaos in the late 380s to early 390s, the Northern Wei dynasty under Tuoba Gui gradually grew stronger as it defeated one neighboring tribe after another. This led to a rift to form between Northern Wei and later Yan, with Northern Wei realigning itself with Western Yan instead. Murongs, despite his advanced age, was still determined to expand his state during whatever years were left of his life. His armies crossed the Yellow River and conquered Qing and Yan provinces from the Eastern Jin dynasty. In 392, he also conquered Zhai Wei, gaining a foothold in the central plain south of the Yellow River. In 394, Murongs personally led a westward invasion of Western Yan. Western Yan begged both Eastern Jin and Northern Wei to send reinforcements. The Eastern Jin reinforcements never showed up, whereas the Northern Wei reinforcements merely sat on its border to intimidate later Yan from invading. Western Yan fell later that year, and its emperor was captured and executed. Most of the Western Yan territories were annexed by later Yan, except for the Hedong region that went to later Qin. The following year, in 395, Later Yan launched an expedition against Northern Wei. Murongs was finally too old to lead another campaign, and the expedition was led by the Crown Prince Murongbao at the head of an army 98,000 strong. As the Later Yan army approached, Tuoba Gui evacuated his people and herds to the south bank of the Yellow River. The Later Yan army began to build ships to cross the Yellow River, but as winter approached, they were forced to abort the effort. They burned their ships and went on a casual retreat home. A sudden winter storm caused the waters of the Yellow River to freeze over, allowing the Northern Wei cavalry to ride back across the ice-covered Yellow River. The Later Yan army, encamped at Canghe Slope, woke up one morning surrounded by the Northern Wei army. In the ensuing Battle of Canghe Slope, tens of thousands of Later Yan soldiers drowned or stampeded one another to death. Murongbao fled home with only a few dozen survivors. About 40 to 50,000 Later Yan soldiers, with nowhere to escape, surrendered. But worried about his state's ability to absorb such a large number of prisoners and not wanting them to return home to fight against him either, Tuoba Gui had them executed, with their bodies piled up high in a mound at the side of the battlefield. Murongs now had little choice but to personally lead an expedition against Northern Wei the following year in 396 with the remaining troops that he could still muster. The Later Yan army easily won some initial victories, with Murongs occupying Pingcheng, modern-day Datong. Tuoba Gui avoided battle and evacuated to the Yin Mountains. But Murongs' health was finally beginning to fail, and as he traveled past Canghe Slope, the emotional shock of seeing the bodies of so many of his men and regrets over the mistakes he had made that led to their deaths all caused his health to deteriorate even more. He was forced to retreat home and died in camp before reaching Zhongshan. Afterwards, Murongbao became the new emperor of Later Yan. In late 396, Tuoba Gui launched a series of massive southward offensives against Later Yan. After capturing Jinyang, modern-day Taiyuan, his army swept eastward onto the North China Plain. The Later Yan armies initially retreated to major cities such as Zhongshan and Ye rather than risk open battle. In early 397, rebellions began to break out in Tuoba Gui's newly occupied territories, and Tuoba Gui offered Murongbao a peace settlement. But now thinking that he stood a chance against Tuoba Gui, Murongbao turned down the peace offer and gathered an army some 200,000 strong and met Tuoba Gui's army at Baisi. The Later Yan army initially attacked the Northern Wei camp at night, forcing the Northern Wei army to flee. But in the darkness, the Later Yan soldiers began to mistakenly attack one another, allowing Tuoba Gui to lead a successful counterattack. After the initial encounter, morale in the Later Yan army gradually began to decline, and Murongbao decided to retreat back to Zhongshan. But with the Northern Wei army in pursuit, Murongbao panicked and fled to Zhongshan with 20,000 cavalry, leaving the rest of his soldiers to freeze to death or surrender to Northern Wei. As the Northern Wei army approached Zhongshan, the Later Yan soldiers repeatedly petitioned to Murongbao to let them meet the Northern Wei army in battle, especially since most of them had relatives who had died at Canghe Slope and they wanted revenge. But Murongbao repeatedly wavered on the decision to fight, leading to a great deal of frustration from his men. Murongbao also offered peace terms to Tuoba Gui, which Tuoba Gui even accepted, but at the last minute Murongbao reneged on the offer. Infighting began to break out among the defenders at Zhongshan, at which point Murongbao led 10,000 cavalry to break out of Zhongshan to flee to the Later Yan ancestral capital at Longcheng, abandoning his remaining subjects in Zhongshan to Tuoba Gui's army. Leaderless, the defenders in Zhongshan still refused to surrender because they did not want a repeat of what happened at Canghe Slope. Even Tuoba Gui was forced to admit that maybe, just maybe, murdering his enemies was not always the best solution. As the siege dragged on, many soldiers in Tuoba Gui's camp died of plague, but Tuoba Gui held on firmly. Finally, in late 397, the defenders of Zhongshan ran out of food and had no choice but to surrender, giving Tuoba Gui control of most of Hebei. In Longcheng, Murongbao was killed by his subordinates in 398, and after multiple rounds of coups, the Xianbei nobility selected Murongxi, a son of Murongs, as emperor. A bit of normalcy finally returned to Later Yan, even if it was reduced to a tiny fraction of what it once was, and remote enough that it went back to instituting separate government organizations for its barbarian and Han Chinese subjects. Further to the south, Murongde, the younger brother of Murongs and the uncle of Murongbao, held on to the garrison at Ye. But faced with growing pressure from Northern Wei after the fall of Zhongshan, he first evacuated to Huatai, located on the south bank of the Yellow River next to a key fort, and later abandoned Huatai to re-establish himself further east in Qing and Yan provinces. In 398, isolated from the rest of Later Yan, Murongde declared himself the king of Yan, and the following year declared himself emperor, with his capital at Guanggu. This version of Yan became known in history as Southern Yan, and even though it was physically small, was densely populated and highly prosperous. Murongde died in 405, with the throne afterwards passing to his nephew Murongchao. Tuoba Gui now controlled almost all of northern China north of the Yellow River. He declared himself emperor in 398 and became posthumously known as Emperor Daowu of the Northern Wei dynasty. He moved his capital southward from Shengle to Pingcheng on the banks of the Sanggan River. Although Pingcheng was only a short distance from Shengle, it was no longer on the steppes but rather in the traditional Chinese settled agriculture regions, even if still out on the periphery. Pingcheng was a highly unusual choice for a capital city, and was chosen because its mountainous surroundings and proximity to the Tuoba heartlands provided Northern Wei with a secure base to project its power onto the newly conquered plains. Much of the Tuoba Xianbei was still nomadic at this time, and Emperor Daowu awarded his most loyal supporters with large land grants around Pingcheng for them to settle on, with large numbers of defeated peoples awarded to the Tuoba elites to work as serfs on their newly established estates. Hundreds of thousands of farmers from across occupied regions in northern China were forcibly resettled in this region, so much so that even as early as Emperor Daowu's reign, up to 1 million people may have already lived there. To support such a large population living in a region with harsh climate and poor soils, grains often needed to be brought in from neighboring regions during years with poor harvests. Large numbers of defeated Gaoche were also forcibly resettled north of Pingcheng, but because of their highly nomadic culture compared to the other resettled groups, they were allowed to keep their tribal affiliations intact, although they now pay tribute to Northern Wei and serve as auxiliaries in the Northern Wei armies. To govern all the newly conquered peoples, Emperor Daowu, while maintaining separate ruling structures for his barbarian and Han Chinese subjects, also began to compel educated Chinese scholar bureaucrats from across the north to serve in his government at Pingcheng. But despite some very forceful convincing from Emperor Daowu, he still had trouble getting buy-in from the northern elites to leave their comfortable estates to travel all the way north to Pingcheng just to serve under a barbarian emperor. One major exception, though, was Cui Hong, who came from the Cui clan of Qinghe. Like many others, he was initially coerced to work in Pingcheng, but after arriving gradually became a key confidant of Emperor Daowu and helped Emperor Daowu set up the Northern Wei government apparatus and codify its laws. His son Cui Hao also became an important member of the Northern Wei court. As a result of Cui Hong and Cui Hao's influence, the Cui clan of Qinghe, which already had a distinguished history, quickly became one of the most powerful families in the north. Even though Emperor Daowu actively recruited Chinese scholar bureaucrats to serve in his government, he was still careful to maintain the Tuoba Xianbei identity of his empire. When a subject of his returned to Pingcheng after years of serving as a prisoner in Chang'an under Later Qin, during which he picked up a great deal of Confucian customs, he was eventually executed for behaving too much like a foreigner. Emperor Daowu also continued his wars against other nomadic groups, including the Rouran. Due to continued incursions from Northern Wei, a Rouran chieftain named Yujiulü Shelun was forced to lead his people even further north across the Gobi Desert to what is now central Mongolia, where they defeated and absorbed large numbers of Gaoche tribes and remnants of the Xiongnu. His domains grew to reach the Greater Khingan Mountains to the east, the Altai Mountains to the west, the Gobi Desert to the south, and Lake Baikal to the north. In 402, he took the title Khagan, or the Great Khan in English, making him the first of countless Central Asian rulers to do so. Yujiulü Shelun also improved the chain of command and discipline of his army, turning it into a potent fighting force. The newly powerful Rouran Khaganate began to re-exert pressure on its old enemy, Northern Wei. The people of Northern Wei, in turn, despised the Rouran, referring to them as the Ranran, literally meaning the worms. As Northern Wei was growing under Emperor Daowu, Later Qin also continued to grow under Yao Xing, who conquered Luoyang and parts of the central plains from the Eastern Jin dynasty. Yao Xing also gained the support of various tribal leaders on the frontier, including Liu Bobo, who was now entering adulthood and handed an important command along the bend of the Yellow River to defend against Northern Wei. Yao Xing was warned to not give Liu Bobo so much power, because despite the young Liu Bobo's charisma and charm, he was also temperamental and cruel. Yao Xing ignored the warnings. In the far northwest, Lu Guang was busy fighting a long series of wars against Western Qin under its leader Qifu Qiangui throughout the decade of the 390s. The brutality and devastation that Lu Guang brought to the region made him more and more enemies over time, including the Tufa Xianbei, which, like their Xianbei brethren from Western Qin, had also been growing stronger after the collapse of the former Qin dynasty, eventually declaring in 397 a state that also became named Liang, known in history as Southern Liang. As the army of Lu Guang, which was mostly made up of D soldiers, became depleted after years of fighting, Lu Guang was forced to recruit more and more from the local Liang province population, including a people known in Chinese as the Lu Shui Hu. Hu is the generic Chinese term for barbarians, and Lu Shui Hu literally just means the barbarians living along the Lu River, a tributary of the Ruoshui River. Their ancestry is unclear, and they may have been descended from the Xiongnu, even though they have lived in the region for centuries among the native Han Chinese population and were already partially Sinicized. They still maintained their nomadic customs and tribal affiliations and likely kept their native language. During the chaos of the 16 kingdoms, they gradually formed their own militia, some of which Lu Guang incorporated into his own army. In 397, Lu Guang launched yet another invasion of Western Qin with an army that included contingents from the Lu Shui Hu. Lu Guang's younger brother was killed in the fighting, after which several leaders of the Lu Shui Hu were scapegoated and executed. Over 10,000 members of the Lu Shui Hu gathered for the funeral, and a nephew of the executed leaders named Juqu Mengxun stoked the pent-up anger from the gathered tribesmen, starting a rebellion against Lu Guang. As the rebellion grew, Juqu Mengxun and his cousin Juqu Nancheng selected a well-regarded Han Chinese scholar bureaucrat named Duan Ye as their leader. The resulting political entity, which was also eventually named Liang, became known in history as Northern Liang. As Northern Liang fought against other tribes and warlords in the area, Duan Ye appointed a Han Chinese general named Li Gao, who came from an elite family in the region, as the governor of Dunhuang in the far western tip of the Hexi corridor. Li Gao's territories were so remote that he was soon able to declare independence, with his state named, you guessed it, Liang, known in history as Western Liang. It was a tiny state with a minuscule population on the far outer edge of the Chinese world, although was also one of the few northern political entities from this time period to be controlled by a Han Chinese ruler. Lu Guang died in 399 with his dynasty teetering on the verge of collapse, and the multiple coups that took place immediately after his death, which eventually brought Lu Guang's nephew Lu Long onto the throne, did not help matters either. In 400, Later Qin launched a large-scale invasion westward. It first forced the submission of the Western Qin dynasty under Qifu Qiangui, who became a Later Qin vassal. It then pushed on into Later Liang territory along with both Northern Liang and Southern Liang. In 401, Lu Long surrendered to Later Qin, although he was allowed to hold on to Guzang as a vassal. Meanwhile, in Northern Liang, as the power of Juqu Mengxun and Juqu Nancheng grew, Juqu Mengxun tried to convince his cousin to rebel with him against Duan Ye, but Juqu Nancheng refused to do so. Undeterred, Juqu Mengxun went to Duan Ye and falsely accused Juqu Nancheng of treason, causing Duan Ye to put Juqu Nancheng to death. Juqu Mengxun then turned around and used the wrongful death of Juqu Nancheng to rally his men to rebel against Duan Ye, who was eventually defeated and killed. Juqu Mengxun became the ruler of Northern Liang. The armies of both Northern Liang under Juqu Mengxun and Southern Liang under its new leader Tufa Rutan continued to invade Later Liang. Guzang was besieged by northern Liang forces, and as many as 100,000 inhabitants starved to death. Many of Lü Long's subjects begged to be allowed to leave Guzang even if they were to fall into the hands of the enemies as slaves, but Lü Long, continuing his family's tradition of cruelty, had them all executed instead. The situation in Guzang grew so desperate by 403 that Lü Long had no choice but to hand over direct control of the city to Later Qin, ending the later Liang dynasty. Faced with the growing influence of Later Qin in the region, southern Liang under Tuoba Gui also submitted to it as a vassal. The conquest of Guzang and the submission of Tuoba Gui elevated the Later Qin dynasty into one of the key states in northern China alongside Northern Wei. It controlled both the traditional Chinese capitals at Chang'an and Luoyang, Hedong, and large portions of the northwestern frontier, along with the vassalage of powerful tribal leaders such as Qifu Qiangui, Tuoba Gui, and Liu Bobo, even if their loyalties remained questionable at best. In 402, Emperor Daowu of Northern Wei sent an envoy to Chang'an to propose a marriage alliance between the two dynasties, but Yao Xing arrogantly refused and detained the envoy. Northern Wei retaliated by attacking various tribes aligned with Later Qin and also Hedong, at which point Yao Xing escalated things by sending a 40,000-strong army to invade Northern Wei. Emperor Daowu personally led an army southward, forcing the Later Qin army to retreat and eventually besieging it at Chaibi on the east bank of the Fei River. Yao Xing also personally led a relief force, but was repulsed. In late 402, the besieged army at Chaibi tried to break out of the encirclement and was completely annihilated in the process. Northern Wei pressed on to attack deep into Hedong. Yao Xing swallowed his pride and repeatedly sued for peace, but was rejected each time. It was only when the Zhouran, which was allied with Later Qin, began to attack Northern Wei from the north that Emperor Daowu was forced to retreat. Relations remained tense between Northern Wei and Later Qin over the few ensuing years. But despite his mixed military record, Yao Xing was still one of the more enlightened rulers of this chaotic era and did the usual things that enlightened monarchs do, such as rebuilding the bureaucracy, freeing slaves, revamping the law code, encouraging Confucian scholarship, and reopening schools. But above all else, he is remembered as being a fervent Buddhist and oversaw critical moments in the growth of Chinese Buddhism. Although Buddhism had arrived in China around the 1st century AD, it remained a fringe movement during its first few centuries in China. The social upheaval that took place across China in the 300s, but especially in the north, provided it with fertile ground to grow. Many barbarian rulers, unencumbered by Confucian traditions, were also quite receptive to Buddhist ideas. In the south, it also began to gain followers alongside Taoism among the elites, who were still very much obsessed with xuanxue like their forefathers did during the Western Jin dynasty. Early Buddhism in China, though, still faced many unique challenges, especially the lack of accurate, well-translated Buddhist texts. By then, Buddhism had existed in India for over 700 years, with a rich tradition of monastic regulations and a dizzying array of scholarship. Very few of this knowledge had made its way to China, and the few texts that did haphazardly make its way over were often poorly translated into Chinese. The Chinese who were exposed to Buddhism also tended to interpret its ideas through the Confucian and Taoist principles that they were already familiar with. Not that there was anything wrong with this in and of itself, it was only natural for a new introduced belief system to absorb local ideas, and ultimately schools of Chinese Buddhism that would develop centuries later, such as Chan or Zen Buddhism as it became known in Japan, drew on ideas from pre-existing Chinese philosophies anyway. But in the 300s AD, Buddhism was still so new in China that people's understanding of it was limited by what they already knew through the pre-existing Chinese philosophical systems, rather than having a thorough understanding of the Buddhistic philosophical system in its own right, and then introducing other Chinese elements to it. An important early figure in Chinese Buddhism was the monk Daowu, who was born in Hebei in 312 and spent the first part of his life in the north. But as political order collapsed across northern China in the 350s and 360s, he fled to Xiangyang, where he established a monastery. He was highly active with teaching and translating, all while encouraging a large number of his colleagues and disciples to spread Buddhist teachings to other regions of the south. He also formulated some key Chinese monastic regulations and oversaw the translation of Buddhist scriptures from Sanskrit into Chinese, even if he did not speak Sanskrit himself. After Xiangyang fell to the former Qin dynasty in 379, Daowu was taken prisoner to Chang'an. The former Qin emperor Fujian was also highly interested in Buddhism, and under his patronage, Daowu spent the final years of his life in Chang'an continuing his work. An even more influential figure in early Chinese Buddhism was the monk Kumarajiva. He was born in 344 in the kingdom of Kucha, one of many oasis city-states in the Tarim Basin. Kucha, like the other city-states in the region, was heavily Buddhist during this period. His father was an Indian prince and a successful Buddhist scholar in his own right, while his mother, also a devout Buddhist, was a princess of Kucha. In his youth, he traveled across Central Asia studying Buddhist scriptures, and over time his reputation as a Buddhist scholar spread far beyond Kucha to even China. In 382, when Fujian sent Lu Guang on his expedition to conquer the Tarim Basin, a secondary objective of the expedition was to bring Kumarajiva to Chang'an. Kumarajiva was a prisoner under Lu Guang when he established the later Liang dynasty. Lu Guang is one of the last people we would expect to care about the finer intricacies of Buddhist philosophy, but even he realized that Kumarajiva was a VIP who may have some political value to him. Lu Guang held Kumarajiva as a prisoner for many years, during which Kumarajiva was forced to give up his Buddhist vows and marry, even if he was also able to become fluent in Chinese during this time. Finally, with the defeat of later Liang in 401, Kumarajiva was freed by the later Qin army and brought to Chang'an, where he soon became a highly respected teacher under the patronage of Yaoxing, frequently giving lectures to large numbers of monks and the elites of society. Even more importantly than his lectures, he headed a translation school where he collaborated with hundreds of assistants to translate a large corpus of Buddhist texts into Chinese. Many of his translations, which were elegantly written in Chinese while preserving the accuracy of the original Sanskrit text, remain the most widely adopted Chinese versions to this day. Even though Buddhism had already been growing rapidly in China for generations, it was in Chang'an during the first decade of the 400s, under the extravagant patronage of Yaoxing and the watchful eyes of Kumarajiva, that it finally took the key step it needed to become one of the key belief systems in China. It became highly popular across northern China, including at the courts of Northern Wei and southern Yan. It was also quite popular in the court of the Eastern Jin dynasty, where Buddhist monks competed with Taoist monks for influence. A third influential Buddhist monk from this time period was Fa Xian, who was already in his 60s when he set out westward from Chang'an in 399 alongside a few other monks in search of more Buddhist texts, especially those in regards to monastic rules. His journey took him through the Tarim Basin, and from there through Tashkurgan, situated in a narrow mountain pass through the Karakoram Mountains on the border between what is now China and Pakistan, to a number of small states in the northern Indian subcontinent such as Peshawar, until 405, when he reached Pataliputra, modern-day Patna, then the capital of the Gupta Empire at the height of its power under its emperor Chandragupta II. After spending several years in Pataliputra, learning Sanskrit in the process, he spent a few more years in Tamralipta on the mouth of the Ganges River, and then a few more years in what is now Sri Lanka before sailing back home towards China in 412. His ship was blown off course multiple times, taking him as far south as Java, until he finally landed in the Shandong Peninsula, after which he made his way to Jiankang, where he spent the rest of his life translating Buddhist scriptures in collaboration with an Indian monk named Buddhabhadra. He also wrote an account of his travels named A Record of Buddhistic Kingdoms, which remains an important source of information for Central Asian and Indian history. While Yaoxing was busy patronizing Buddhism, affairs on the northwestern frontier gradually deteriorated. Guzang was too far away from the rest of Later Qin for it to hold on to effectively against the continual attacks from Juqu Mengxun, and eventually Yaoxing had little choice but to give control of Guzang to Tuoba Gui, whom he did not fully trust either. But after controlling Guzang, Tuoba Gui became even more independent-minded and difficult to control. Liu Bobo was also growing more powerful along the bend of the Yellow River. In 407, Later Qin and Northern Wei began to establish diplomatic relations with one another, exchanging prisoners in the process. This gave Liu Bobo the casus belli to intercept 8,000 horses sent by the Rouran to Later Qin, breaking his vassalage to Yaoxing. He also betrayed the nearby Xianbei tribe that had taken him in when he first escaped from Northern Wei as a child and incorporated its people into his ranks. No longer content with the surname of Liu, he created a new surname for himself, He Lian, with He meaning distinguished and Lian meaning to be connected to, in this case with heaven itself. He became known in history as He Lian Bobo, and his dynasty, which he named Xia, became known in history as He Lian Xia. But instead of choosing one city as his capital and home base, He Lian Bobo decided to maximize the element of surprise by roaming the region with his cavalry, launching raids into Later Qin territories. In late 407, he also proposed a marriage alliance with Tuoba Gui, which was rejected. He subsequently raided Tuoba Gui's territories, returning home with a large amount of loot. Furious, Tuoba Gui led the bulk of his army to pursue the retreating He Lian Bobo, but was lured into an ambush, leading to most of his important generals and ministers to be killed in the fighting. He Lian Bobo had the bodies of his victims piled high in a mound that he referred to as the Platform of Skulls. Now shifting our attention to the northeast in later Yan, Emperor Murongs, despite his state being small, remote, and poor, still did many outrageous things, such as building lavish palaces for himself. After his empress died in 407, he led a massive funeral procession out of the capital city at Longcheng. While he was gone, the army in Longcheng rebelled and chose Murongyun, a Korean from Goguryeo who had been adopted into the Murong family, as their leader. The rebels refused to allow Murongs back into the city, forcing Murongs to flee to one of his palaces in the countryside, where he was hunted down and killed. His death marked the end of the later Yan dynasty. Murongyun was declared the new emperor of Yan, with this version of Yan known in history as Northern Yan. He also changed his surname back to his original surname of Gao, so is usually referred to in history as Gaoyun. He was assassinated a few years later in 409, and in the ensuing chaos, the throne went to his associate Feng Ba, one of the few Han Chinese to become ruler of a northern state during this time period. That same year, the Eastern Jin dynasty invaded the Southern Yan dynasty, conquering it in 410. The fall of Southern Yan marked the end of the Murongs as a ruling family after having dominated northeastern China for the best part of a century. Many of its descendants still managed to live as prominent nobles in the north over the ensuing generations, becoming fully Sinicized in the process, and Murong remains a rare Chinese surname to this day. In Northern Wei, Emperor Daowu was also becoming more brutal as a ruler, supposedly because he was abusing the 5 minerals powder like many other people of this time period did. He became increasingly anxious and deranged, sometimes staying awake all night or not eating any food for days. He began to execute prominent people for offenses that were supposed to have long been forgiven, or otherwise wantonly killing people, sometimes with his own hands, if they behaved suspiciously around him, such as appearing nervous or stuttering. Emperor Daowu also became very concerned about the issue of succession. The traditional Chinese concept of passing the entire empire to one chosen son was foreign to the Tuoba Xianbei, where alternative means of succession such as power passing to the younger brother of the deceased monarch, or simply splitting the inheritance, was far more routine. He went to extreme ways to ensure that his dynasty would not splinter after his death like many other nomadic states have done, including instituting a notorious Northern Wei policy that became known as elevating the son and so killing the mother. That is, systematically putting to death the mother of the dynasty's chosen heir. This was a highly uncomfortable topic for ancient historians to write about, and the sources we have today are filled with vague euphemisms about what happened or deliberately leaving certain details unsaid for later generations to read between the lines. Emperor Daowu supposedly modeled this policy after an ancient Tuoba tradition, but as many modern historians have commented, this excuse is complete nonsense. He also reportedly drew inspiration from Emperor Wu of the Han dynasty, who ordered the death of the mother of the future Emperor Zhao to prevent her from eventually gaining control of the government. The twisted rationale for Emperor Daowu's decision was likely that because marriage alliances play major roles in tribal politics, and a woman with strong backing from her tribe could leverage it to support her son's claim to the succession, Emperor Daowu thought that if he were to preemptively kill the mother of the crown prince, He could also prevent her relatives from eventually growing too powerful at court. After all, he himself only secured his power because of backing from his own maternal relatives, and he did not want others to do the same. And so in 409, while selecting the 17-year-old Tuoba Gui to be the crown prince, he also ordered the suicide of Tuoba Gui's mother. Tuoba Gui, who was close to his mother, was so distraught that he continued to mourn for her after her death, and he eventually fled the capital to go into hiding in the nearby mountains to avoid upsetting his father even further. Not long after, Emperor Daowu also had another concubine arrested in preparation for execution. The concubine sent a message to her biological son Tuoba Gui for help. Although Tuoba Gui was still a teenager, he had already been displaying large amounts of reckless behavioral issues such as assaulting people on the streets or torturing animals. And that same night, he scaled the walls of the palace with the assistance of a few eunuchs. As he approached his father's bedroom, the palace guards shouted a warning, waking up Emperor Daowu, but it was too late. Emperor Daowu was murdered by his son that night in his own bedroom. He was only 38 years old. The next day, Tuoba Gui gathered the ministers and nobles in the palace and forced them to submit to him, which they did. But not long after, Tuoba Gui, still in exile in the nearby mountains, brought together a band of supporters and marched back onto the capital. Tuoba Gui was forced to commit suicide along with his mother. Tuoba Gui became the new Northern Wei emperor, known posthumously as Emperor Mingyuan. He was much less militarily active than his father, giving his people time to recover from the decades of wars under Emperor Daowu. In the northwest, the influence of Yaoxing on the frontier regions continued to diminish. Qifu Qiangui rebelled in 409, re-establishing the Western Qin dynasty. Fighting also continued between southern Liang under Tufa Rutan and northern Liang under Juqu Mengxun, who decisively defeated Tufa Rutan in 410 and then finally captured Guzang in 411, later moving his capital there from Zhangye. He Liangbobo's powers also grew. In 413, he finally decided that it was time to set up base in a capital city, and conscripted some 100,000 barbarian and Han Chinese laborers to build a city from scratch near the bend of the Yellow River named Tongwan, or literally, to rule over 10,000, with 10,000 in this case just signifying an indefinitely large number. After the walls of Tongwan, which like most ancient Chinese walls were made of rammed earth, had been completed, his inspectors tested the strength of the walls by thrusting iron rods into them. And if the iron rods were to sink more than an inch into the walls, the workers responsible for that section of the walls will be executed. Whatever the truth of this story may have been, the ruins of Tongwan remain standing today on the edge of the Ordos Desert. He also reportedly tested his military equipment against each other. If the arrows failed to pierce the armor, he executed the bowmakers. And if the arrows did pierce the armor, he executed the armorsmiths. He Liangbobo, at the head of a formidable army built through terror, continued his raids into Later Qin, repeatedly defeating the Later Qin army sent out against him and gradually encroaching onto large swaths of land north of the Fei River Valley. In southern Liang, years of non-stop wars led to a famine to break out. In 414, Tufa Rutan had little choice but to lead an expedition to raid the livestock of a neighboring tribe. But while he was gone, Western Qin under Qifu Qiangui swooped in and occupied his lands. Tufa Rutan was forced to surrender to Western Qin, ending the Southern Liang dynasty. He was initially treated with respect by Qifu Qiangui, but was poisoned in 415. Yaoxing died in 416. Although he left behind a rich cultural legacy and an empire that, for the time being, was still standing strong, it was in a precarious state surrounded by enemies in all directions. Not only He Lianxia and Northern Wei to the north, but also a resurgent Eastern Jin dynasty to the south. You may have wondered why we haven't talked much about the Eastern Jin dynasty over the past 30 years of our narrative, and that is because, as we shall find out in the next video, it was simply too busy dealing with just about every catastrophe imaginable: rebellions, civil wars, famines, coups, murders, assassinations, you name it, for it to worry about the north. Juqu Mengxun conquered Western Liang, with its capital at Jiuquan, in 420, finally bringing all of the Hexi corridor under his control. Although Western Liang was a fairly insignificant state, its ruling family remained in the north as a powerful Confucian aristocratic house, long after the dynasty's demise. Not to mention that, centuries later, it would end up with some very, very important people as its descendants. Emperor Mingyuan died in 423, and his peaceful reign did much to help Northern Wei become established in the north. He was succeeded by his son Tuoba Gui, who would become posthumously known as Emperor Daowu. As a child, Tuoba Gui was taken from his mother to be raised by a nanny, and some time later his biological mother died. Her cause of death is unclear, although it is very likely that she, too, was ordered to commit suicide. And so while Emperor Daowu started this policy, it was Emperor Mingyuan who maintained it despite personally suffering from it, in the process turning it from a one-off incident into a tradition of sorts. Our narrative is arriving near the end of the time period from 304 to 439 known as the 5 Barbarians and 16 Kingdoms period, probably the most chaotic century in Chinese history. The first person recorded to have used the phrase the 5 barbarians was Emperor Fujian of the former Qin dynasty, although who exactly he was referring to remains unclear. It was only many centuries later that the 5 barbarians began to specifically refer to the Xiongnu, Jie, Xianbei, Qiang, and Di, 5 of the most prominent peoples from this time period. But as we have seen from this video, these were not the only barbarian groups in northern China, and in any case identifications among tribal societies could be quite fluid, and it was common for defeated tribes to simply realign themselves with the victors. The 16 Kingdoms moniker was initially coined by a historian named Cui Hong, a member of the Cui clan of Qinghe, who lived in the late 400s to early 500s. He wrote a history book of this time period, which is now lost, named The Spring and Autumn of the 16 Kingdoms, in which he selected 16 of the most prominent, longest-lasting political entities from this time period, with the most complete historical records for inclusion into the 16 Kingdoms, even though many more than 16 political entities existed in northern China during this time period. And as we have also seen from this video, even among the 16 kingdoms, many of their leaders also blur the boundaries between independent rulers, vassals, and subjects, frequently changing from one identity to another. A mnemonic in Chinese to remember the 16 kingdoms by is 五梁、四燕、三秦、二赵、成汉、胡夏, or in English, the 5 Liangs, 4 Yans, 3 Qins, 2 Zhaos, 成汉, barbarian Xia. The 5 Liangs were former, later, northern, southern, and western Liang, and we covered 4 of the 5 in this video. The 4 Yans were former, later, southern, and northern Yan, 3 of which we covered in this video. Western Yan, which was also a fairly significant state in its own right, was not included in the 16 kingdoms. The 3 Qins were former, later, and western Qin, all of which we dealt with in this video. The 2 Zhaos were former and later Zhao, which existed in the early to mid-300s. Cheng Han was a dynastic state in southwestern China during the first half of the 300s. Barbarian Xia refers to Helian Xia. The 16 kingdoms also do not include the 2 most prominent states from this period, Northern Wei, which will go on to conquer all of northern China, and Eastern Jin, which was established by members of the original Chinese government that had fled to southern China when the barbarian revolts first took place. And here you have it, all the major political entities from the most chaotic century in Chinese history. It is an overwhelming number of names to learn. But do keep in mind that even for people who have been reading Chinese history for many years, this period is still often just a blur. Of the 16 kingdoms, the most important ones to know are the 2 Zhaos, for their roles in the initial barbarian revolt against Jin dynasty rule, former Qin for its role in the Battle of the Fei River, and later Qin for its role in the early history of Chinese Buddhism. After this, former and later Yan are good to know due to the importance of the Murongs family, and still after this, southern Yan and Helian Xia are both also good to know due to the wars that they fought against the Eastern Jin dynasty, which we will cover in the next video. The rest, though, are much more obscure, and pretty much just fall into the category of good to know if you are really interested in a deep dive.